Hi again. Let's talk about part two of the speaking test. So this is definitely the part of the speaking test that people tend to worry the most about. The reason for that is because speaking for 2 minutes is difficult, especially with such a short preparation time of 1 minute in an exam situation where you're feeling nervous. It's even for a native English speaker, it's a difficult thing to do. So it's understandable that people feel nervous when they think about having to do this task. It definitely takes practice to be able to do it effectively. And again, this isn't necessarily a language skill, but more of a speaking skill in terms of like presentation skills, because even a native English speaker will struggle with this and ideally will need to practice this task plenty of times so they can do it successfully. So a minute isn't a lot of time. That's one issue. Speaking for 2 minutes in a coherent way that's easy to follow is another issue. And again, like exam conditions make it even more difficult because you're nervous, and when people are nervous, they tend to pause and stop a bit, and that can really affect your score. So there are a few things to consider about this part of the test when you're thinking about what it is that people worry about. So number one, having some pausing. That's natural, and pretty much everybody will do that. Having, pausing while you're speaking is natural. If you pause excessively and that pausing blocks the message or is distracting to the listener, to the examiner, that's one thing. If you just pause on occasion to kind of catch your breath and consider where your story is going next, that's another thing, and that's natural, and there's no penalty for that. Another issue is people worry about what's on the card, so you'll be given a topic and then it'll say you should say, and there'll be 3 bullet points and then a final bullet point. So talk about a holiday you enjoyed. You should say where you went, who you went with, what you did there, and why you enjoyed it, something like that. So those points are there to kind of help you. It's an acknowledgement that you only have a minute, which isn't much time, and you've got to speak for 2 minutes coherently. So we're putting these points here to help you out. However, you do not have to speak about any of the bullet points. You probably will, just naturally in your answer, but it's not a requirement that you speak about the bullet points. You can talk about all of them, none of them. You can talk about the last one first and the first one last. You can spend a minute and a half on one and a half a minute on the other 3. It absolutely does not matter. One problem that people have when they follow the bullet points is they tend to run out of things to say quite quickly because they're just answering the questions and they haven't really thought about how they're going to give a full answer for 2 minutes. Now, some people don't have that problem. Some people just follow the bullet points. They can speak for 2 minutes every time. And if you can do that, there's no reason to change what you're doing. So there's lots of strategies out there on the internet. And to be honest, none is better than any of the others. What a strategy should do should help you get through that 2 minutes and be able to give a coherent answer without too much hesitation and without making too many mistakes. If it does that for you, then that's perfect. You don't need to worry about, well, is this strategy better than that strategy? It absolutely doesn't matter. And I'll talk a bit about some of those specific strategies a little bit later in the video. The third issue that people generally have is with this 1 minute of preparation time. So it's very little time to prepare to speak for a minute, particularly under exam conditions. And if you've done the exam, it goes by so fast. So one of the main issues that people have with part 2 of the speaking test is what they do with that minute. People who use that minute effectively generally do well on part 2. People who do not use that minute effectively generally do not. They have problems of running out of things to say, talking in circles, repeating themselves. Yeah, it can be really difficult if you're not prepared when you start speaking. When I was an examiner, the students, you give them a little piece of paper, square of white paper, and they write notes if they want. They have to leave them in the room, and I would often look at the papers after the end of the shift. And it was surprising what you would see there. So often people who do well don't write anything. Sometimes they write a lot. Sometimes people who do well write a few words. But it's also the case that often people who don't do well, you can see what they've written on the paper. It's not very helpful. So if you look at the website, the lesson notes under the video, you'll see an example of this. And It's just, writing basic words, taking that minute and writing words that you're not going to forget. If the basic, like if you're talking about films, like writing film, actor, action movie, like if that's what you're going to talk about, you're not going to forget those words very likely. So it's just that people don't know what to do with that minute, and they're given paper and pencil, so they assume, well, it's probably a good idea to write something down. And if you had more time, it might be a good idea to sketch an outline of what you're going to say, because you would have time to do it effectively. But because you don't, you've only got a minute, it generally doesn't work. So I would say, like I said before, whatever you do that allows you to get through the 2 minutes and give a cohesive talk, a story that makes sense from beginning to middle end. That's a good way to think about it. Your talk for 2 minutes, it doesn't really need to include anything specific, but it does need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end so that it is cohesive. And again, this is more important at higher scores than lower scores, but it's not that difficult to do, and it can help your score if you can use that 2 minutes to give a lengthy explanation of something or a lengthy description of something. Examiners are, of course, listening for fluency. They're a bit more forgiving in that part than the other parts because speaking for 2 minutes is difficult. But they're also listening for pronunciation. So one of the things about pronunciation, especially for higher scores, is you need to show your ability to use those pronunciation features over longer utterances, like sentences or groups of sentences. So if your fluency is a problem and you're stopping all the time, that makes it difficult for the examiner to hear, and that can make it difficult for you to get a high score in pronunciation. And then also the opportunity that you have to speak fluently for 2 minutes can really help your fluency score. And again, like if you practice enough in the correct way and remain calm and always be thinking ahead about what you're going to say, it's quite easy to speak for 2 minutes without significant amounts of hesitation. So again, it doesn't matter what you do with that minute. What's important is what the result of what you do is. Does it allow you to speak for 2 minutes without lots of hesitation and to be able to complete the task? Another thing you don't need to worry about is going off topic. So there's no penalty for going off topic in the speaking test. Now, if your question is about a holiday and you start talking about your favorite food, that's going to be a problem. But you don't have to stick directly to the topic. As long as you're generally answering the question that's asked, you're generally on topic, the topic that's being asked. So it's about travel, you're talking about travel and holidays. You don't have to worry about going slightly off topic. It's not like the writing test where everything has to be well connected to the question. The ideas need to be connected to each other. So that's not something that you need to worry about. For most people, that's not an issue. In fact, it's very rare to hear someone who has a problem going kind of off topic in a way that the examiner would even notice. So if you think about what you'll actually be talking about, they're all personal experiences. Even the questions which seem like they're not about a personal experience, you can usually relate to a personal experience. So there was a question a couple of years ago, talk about a river in your country. So you might think, I don't know anything about rivers. I know the name of this river in my country, but I don't have any experience with it. You can make it a personal experience. So one student I knew that did very well with this question, he lived in Seoul in South Korea, and there's a river, the Han River, and he named the river, said it's in the middle of Seoul, and there's a commercial complex along the banks of the river, and he likes spending time there. And then most of his talk was about why it's pleasant to spend time at this shopping complex, which is near the river. So he made reference to the river several times during the talk, and that's absolutely fine. This is what I mean, like you don't have to worry so much about being exactly 100% on topic or what you're thinking of as on topic. So because these are personal questions, nearly all of them, that can be answered with talking about personal experience, it's really like you're telling a story. And so it doesn't matter what you do with that minute, but a lot of students have found it very helpful to just not write down anything at all and to just stop. Sometimes they even close their eyes and just think carefully about what you're going to talk about, what happened, picture it in your mind, and then tell the story like you're telling the story to a friend. And as you're speaking, remain calm, don't speak too fast. You'll notice there are opportunities as you speak to add more details. So there's a shopping complex by the end of the river. The last time I went there, I was with my friend so-and-so. We often like to go out with each other on the weekends and do different things. And on this particular weekend, we went down to the river, blah, 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 blah. So as you're talking, you'll see places to add details if you're telling the story and if you've imagined the story well enough during that minute. So again, if you don't have any problems with this, you can get through 2 minutes, no problem, and you have some other way to do it, absolutely do that. But if you don't, try this imagining, picturing, having a picture in your mind and telling the story from that picture. If that doesn't work, there's no magic solution, but if that doesn't work, then try something else. So what you should do is, if you're having an issue with getting through part 2, you should do lots of practice with part 2 questions, time yourself, record yourself, listen to how you sound. Does your story have a kind of beginning, middle, end? Do you pause a lot? Is it easy to follow what you're saying? These things. So with that kind of practice and that kind of feedback you can give yourself, it's quite possible to get really good at giving part 2 talks. If you've done quite a bit of practice with one method and it's not working, don't be afraid to change, but give each one a chance. So like, let's say you just follow the bullet points and that doesn't work for you, and you try this having an image in your mind and telling the story. If that works, good. If it doesn't work, give it some more time. So every time you change the method that you're going to use to talk about a part 2 topic, it's going to take you a little bit of time to adjust to the new method before you'll know whether it's successful or not. So some of the other methods that people commonly use are, there's one called PPF, where you think of 3 different stories, past, present, future. So if the question is about a holiday, you think about a holiday you took in the past, one you're planning to take now, and then maybe your dream holiday, which you want to talk about in the future. Now that telling these 3 stories allows people to speak a little bit less about each one, but because there are 3, it makes it much easier to get through the 2 minutes. So if that works for you, that's absolutely fine. What you shouldn't think is that, I've heard some teachers say that this is the best way to do it because you'll be using past, present, and future verb tenses, and that will help your grammatical range. That is basically nonsense. And the reason for that is because grammar is more than just verb tenses, and your grammatical range is going to come out over the course of the whole test. And the reason why there are all these different types of questions is to get you to use different grammatical structures. If you answer all of the questions naturally without thinking about grammar or without planning, past, present, future, your range of grammar will be varied. So, and if you also think about it, well, yeah, in that version, you're using past, present, and future verb tenses. In some other version of answering part 2, you would be using other grammatical structures, which would also have some kind of variation. So I'm not saying don't use it or do use it. I'm saying if it works for you, use it, but there's not really a reason to think that it's better than any others. Again, if it helps you get through 2 minutes and give a cohesive talk, do it. So other methods I've heard are, thinking of specific people and always figuring them into your answer. So there's lots of questions about people, a famous person, someone in your family. There's lots of questions about cities. So you're having these things that you've thought a lot about, and then as soon as the question comes up that could possibly have to do with the city. So every time you talk about Paris, this time you went to Paris. So if they're asking you about a holiday, you talk about Paris. If they're asking you about the city where you live, you could mention Paris, something, in relation to that. So having these kind of set things that come up again and again and again, that seems like a lot of work to me. It seems kind of unnecessary. And then you run into the same problem where if you're memorizing bits of your answer, it's not going to help you at all. So I mentioned in the lesson on part 1, when you memorize, your intonation becomes very flat. People tend to repeat themselves, pause, and make all sorts of mistakes that are obvious. And so it's not an issue that you're memorizing your answer. The examiner doesn't care, but the examiner is going to hear things like flat intonation and pausing and repeating yourself that have a negative effect on your score. So again, if that works for you and you can do it without doing those things, sure. But generally speaking, that's very difficult. And it's a lot of work, which is, I don't think it's necessary. But again, whatever works for you is what you should do. Another one is to, choose 1 or 2 of the prompts, the bullet points, and really focus on talking about that one a lot. If whatever one that strikes you as something you can speak about. So holiday, a place that you went, what you did there. So like, let's say you went swimming a lot, you can talk about swimming and why you like swimming and things like that. Again, that's fine too, but it doesn't really matter what you say as long as you tell a coherent story, beginning, middle, end. It doesn't matter if you finish, if the examiner interrupts you, to stop you, that's also fine. So the point is to get through 2 minutes to tell a coherent story and to do so without pausing too much. He says after saying without pausing too much. So you can see pausing is natural, and some people do it more than others. It's a natural thing, and you don't need to worry about it unless it is excessive. So the examiner will give you the card, the booklet, and the time will begin for preparing. And then when it's time to start, they'll say, now remember, you've got 1 to 2 minutes for this, so don't worry if I stop you. I'll tell you when the time is up. Can you start speaking now, please? So when they say that, you should start speaking now. It's good to say something like, I'm going to talk about, or today I'm going to talk about, or I'd like to talk about, just introducing what you're saying that way. You don't need to memorize some complicated introduction like, talk about a holiday you enjoyed. Well, of all the holidays I've had, one that comes to mind and I particularly enjoy, like if you've got this kind of complicated memorized structure to introduce your part 2 talk, it doesn't benefit you in any way. Examiners have probably heard it before because most people get these from the internet. It's kind of a difficult way to start speaking, and most people stumble and stop as they're saying it because it's an unnatural, strange thing to say. So really just starting by saying, I'm going to talk about the time that I went to England, something like that. That's fine. That tells the person, this is what I'm going to talk about. Here I go. And if you run out of things to say, like after a minute or so, that's generally a problem. It's not enough, but you don't have to worry. Like your score isn't necessarily damaged. The examiner is going to say, can you tell me anything more about that? They'll ask you to keep talking. Watch their body language. You can tell when they're ready for you to finish, and you can tell if they want you to keep talking. Sometimes they'll even gesture like, do that, or look at you. If you watch their body language, you'll have a pretty good idea of whether it's time to wind it down or they want you to keep talking. But if you do run out after a minute and they prompt you to keep talking and you can do it, that's fine. You're not going to have any problem. They end the talk with the word thank you. So when they say thank you, just stop talking. It doesn't matter if you're finished with your story. That thank you means your 2 minutes is up. This part of the exam is finished. And then they'll ask you a quick question, to make it seem like a normal, it's called a rounding off question. They'll ask you a quick question which isn't scored, and it's just to make it seem like a natural experience, which of course it isn't. But you can, just give a 1 sentence answer. It's fine, or even one word, yes, no. It doesn't matter. So that part is not scored, and just get ready for part 3. One final thing that can be a problem when you're prompted to speak more is that, if you said everything that you're going to say and the examiner prompts you to speak more, then what can happen is you can just start to talk in circles. If you get to a minute 30, a minute 40, they're probably not going to prompt you to speak more if you stop then. Some of them will make you speak all the way up to 2 minutes, but once you get to like around a minute 40, a minute 45, if you stop, by the time they ask you to continue and wait for you to continue, they have to wait a few seconds before they can prompt you to continue. By the time that happens, the 2 minutes is up. So generally, if you get to like around a minute 40, most examiners won't prompt you to speak more. But if they do, one thing you can do is if you've been telling a very specific story. So I'm talking about holidays, let's say. So the same question, talk about a holiday you enjoyed. And I talk all about this holiday that I had in England, and I speak for a minute and 20 seconds, and then I stop. What you can do is go from the specific to the general. So talk about generally what kind of holidays you like, generally even what kind of holidays other people like in your country, or why that holiday was different from most holidays that you've had. So again, going from a specific story to kind of generally talking about the topic is one thing to do. Or if you've been generally talking about the topic, so for example, talk about a shop near where you live, something like this. So often people will just describe the store, describe where it is in the neighborhood, describe how often they go there, describe what kind of things you can buy at the store. And then let's say you get to a minute and 20 and you're done. You can't say anything else. You don't have anything else to say. If you get prompted to speak again, you can go from the general to the specific. So the last time I was at this store, and then talk about what happened then. Again, this is, you can picture in your mind what happened the last time you were at the store. And then that makes it much easier to continue talking. So again, going from the general to the specific, if you need more material to talk about, can be really helpful, or going from the specific to the general if you run out of stuff to talk about. Like part 1, if you look hard enough on the internet, you can find all of the current questions for part 2 of the speaking test. And like for part one, most people think this is fantastic. Some students even will prepare an answer for every single question, which is like dozens of answers. Again, memorizing will be disastrous for your score if you need anything above 6. So don't do it. Plus it takes tons of time and it's just a waste. So that's one thing. The other thing you don't want to do is practice those questions excessively. So practicing from that set of questions, it's kind of it's a toss-up whether you should do it or not. I mean, for some people it's helpful because they're practicing the actual questions they might get. But as I mentioned, when you're practicing, if you're thinking about answers that you've previously given, then again, you're speaking from memory and not speaking spontaneously. And there's a effect on your intonation, making it flat. Generally, there's more pausing and more repetition, self-correction, etc. So that can be a danger if you're practicing from that set of questions. Now, there are always 2 or 3 or 4 just weird questions that can really just stop you in the exam because you have no idea what to say. And the problem that people have with those questions is they don't know what to talk about. So for example, the talk about a river in your country, like if I give you 5 minutes to think about it, you'll come up with something. But 1 minute in an exam situation, the result is often that the person panics and they can't get through the task. So if you do look at this list of questions, look at the list of questions and think about what you would talk about for each of those things. But I wouldn't practice it so much. So if you get to the stage where you get one of the strange questions, let's say talk about a river in your country, and you think, okay, I'm going to talk about this river and the time that I went on holiday and we saw the river, or I'm going to talk about that river and the fact that it's important in the country because of this and this, So just knowing what you're going to say and then think about content of your answer during the exam. But do lots of practice, but don't practice the questions that are currently on the test. Unless, if you're going to do that, you've absolutely got to get feedback from someone on whether or not your intonation is poor, whether or not it's causing excessive self-correction, going back to the beginning of the sentence and starting again, causing a lot of pausing and things like that. So that's something I would not do. But essentially what you want to do for part 2 is try to remain calm, which you can do more easily if you've done lots of practice. Think about what you're going to say. It doesn't matter what you're going to say, but have an image in your mind or a clear plan in your mind of what you're going to say. Stay relaxed, keep talking, and be thinking ahead about where the story is going. So it doesn't matter if you finish the story or not, but it's better to be interrupted by the examiner in the middle of your story than to finish your story after a minute. So keeping those things in mind and doing lots of practice and being flexible about how you approach part 2 is really helpful. And the vast majority of students with a little bit of practice can get much better at it. So it's really not anything to worry about. So for part 2, find a method that works for you. Do plenty of practice. Be aware of strange questions that might come up and what you would talk about if you got one of those questions. Try to relax, not worry, and just tell a story.